Hi, thank you for coming to the channel if you're just checking this out, and for returning subscribers, welcome, and thank you all for your support. Although some of you may feel offended by the things I'm saying here, what I would say to that is this channel is socio-political by nature, and we are going to have different points of view. It may well be that I agree with you on other areas, but on this particular subject, I do have strong views, and it would be disingenuous of me to approach this by pretending to be neutral or non-partisan, because I am. Partisan might be the wrong word, because it's not party politics we're talking about. That's incense if you're wondering. So yeah. What I'll be doing in this video is critiquing what I see as the left's attitude to crime. I just think that there is things that they really miss in terms of the way they put forward their arguments. Now, I'll just play the devil's advocate for a second and try and put myself in their shoes. So I would imagine if I'm a left-leaning person, I look at a justice system that's punitive, that punishes people too much, and I would feel that there needs to be more of a focus on rehabilitation. And I might feel that, oh well, if you put them in prison for a long time, they're just going to be more angry and take it out on society. And it's unfair to punish people who may have family background problems or educational problems or that sort of thing. Right, that is me trying to be open-minded and put myself in their shoes. But I still disagree with it. I just don't think that the approach that they take to this is accurate or frankly logical. So, this is a very emotive subject in this country, any country actually, but I'll focus on the UK. Why? Because it directly involves people's safety, and it directly involves people having the extreme mental trauma of loss, of anxiety, of fear, and everything that's associated with serious crime. But frankly, even so-called minor crime, when it builds up, it can also really affect people's life quality. So for example, if you're a small shop owner and you're constantly targeted by thieves, that is going to really, and you constantly have to replenish your goods and the police do nothing about it, that's going to have an effect on anyone. It's fine for Tesco's and Morrison's or something, they can afford it, but a small shopkeeper, it's going to add up. And antisocial behaviour likewise. It's something I can really relate to, because at 16 I had to leave my home from that problem. Local youth gangs targeted me and my family, our house stood out, and it was a deeply unpleasant experience. So no doubt it shaped my thinking on this, no doubt about it, in terms of my hardline stance on crime, but also my instinctive empathy with victims of that sort of crime. So without further ado, this is why I think the left is wrong on this subject. Almost always, the knee-jerk attitude of people who sway to the left on this is to think of the criminal. Every time. So a typical argument would be, yes, it's awful what happened. It's awful what happened, but we need to focus on rehabilitation. Punishment is punitive. Let's focus on rehabilitation. Let's look at how can we can improve their education or their background and all the rest of it. So the implication of this narrative is that in the UK, we simply lock up people, throw away the key, and never focus on rehabilitation. But actually, it's a disingenuous argument. And this is one of my contentions with the left. Their argument is not entirely honest. They will often cite the Nordic example, because the Nordic countries are known for taking a strong rehabilitation approach. Now, it is true that historically, recent decades, the Nordic countries have enjoyed relatively low crime levels. But that has changed in recent years. In fact, in the case of Sweden, the situation has got so bad regarding gang violence that earlier this year, January 2025, Swedish Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson admitted that the situation was out of control. The number of bomb attacks, this is between rival gangs, was averaging one a day. And we're not talking about a war zone, we're talking about Sweden. This isn't a reference to Haiti or Somalia or another of the world's trouble spots. We're talking about Sweden. Nice, wealthy, progressive Sweden. So when the left go to talk about the Nordic model, they need to be a little bit more honest. It's not as rosy as they make it out to be. Granted, it may have been that way not too long ago, but that has changed now. Sweden has a serious gun violence problem. Per capita, one of the worst rates in Europe, actually. So the left need to stop, holding them up as a great role model. Probably a better comparison, if you really want to make international comparisons, would be Japan. Japan has 125 million people. It's got an extremely low homicide rate. A couple of hundred people a year. Yet Japan takes a hardline approach to crime. So why do the left not cite Japan? Just to be clear, I'm not saying their system is perfect. I'm skeptical of the way they use the death penalty. I don't think that people should be on death row for years and suddenly the door opens and they're brought to the gallows. I think it's a bit callous the way they go about that. And there is question marks over the 99% confession rate and things like that. There's also been examples of people who have been on death row only to be exonerated eventually. So whilst I'm hardline on crime, I'm not totally of the view, just hang them all. No. Ironically, my views on crime would be pretty middle ground. Possibly even the fact that I'm against the death penalty would possibly even be deemed a left-wing perspective if I was in the United States. That's the irony. Here in Europe, the left are so extreme when it comes to crime, so anti-punishment in their ideology, that simply believing in punishment automatically puts you on the right-wing camp. It's ridiculous. So that's the first thing I want to challenge, is this idea that the Nordic states are some sort of utopia. Obviously, they're going to be safer than some parts of the world, yes, but they're not as rosy as they're being made out to be. That is a misconception, particularly not in recent years. Now, another thing I want to challenge is this idea that judicial punishment is revenge or retribution. This is ridiculous. What would revenge be? Really think about that. If someone is a victim of a heinous crime, let's say the home was burned down in an arson attack, they'll be fuming with rage and they'd want to kill the person who done it. That's a human reaction. Or they would want to burn down the house of the person who done it. But what would happen is the arsonist would get a custodial sentence. So how does the left figure out that that is revenge? It's the state and the justice system punishing the offender, not the victim. So I think it's a bit absurd to say that punishment is revenge. It's not. It's justice. And we need to get back to the basic principle that punishment is fairness. That is to say, you hurt society, you pay a price. It's really not rocket science. So they need to stop saying that punishment is revenge or retribution. It's not. It's about holding the offender accountable for what they have done. It's also, incidentally, in the case of custodial sentencing, about actually keeping the public safe. Now, you could all argue all you want about the need for penal reform and recidivism rates and all the rest of it, and there's valid arguments around that. But the reality is, if you have a dangerous offender, when they're behind bars, by definition and sheer common sense, it's safer than when they're outside. That is just a no-brainer. If you get some armed robber or violent drug dealer or, prolific sexual predator, if they're behind bars, they're not hurting the public than if they were outside. It's just common sense. So that's why the need to protect the public has to be a very high priority. Now, again, what the left will say here is, well, the public are better protected if we tackle the root causes of crime and we reduce crime overall. Well, of course, everyone wants to see crime reduced. I'm not arguing about that. But I don't accept this idea that crime can only be reduced by avoiding punishment. You see, I don't say have punishment without rehabilitation. I say have both. But you have to have punishment before rehabilitation. You cannot have a situation where it's crime, rehabilitation, has to be crime, punishment, rehabilitation. Why? Because if you are saying to the offender, okay, we're going to help you try and change your life, but they haven't first of all paid a price for what they've done, how can they really change if they're not being held to account? This is the fundamental flaw with left-wing thinking. They want to go straight to the rehabilitation, and they think punishment is a dirty word. They think justice in this sense is inapplicable. How can you get genuine rehabilitation without punishment? It's nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. It's also reckless because, again, it endangers the public if you are going straight to the rehabilitation stage without first holding that person to account. Now, we also need to consider the populist aspect of this, because populism gets a bad rap, but it shouldn't be totally dismissed. There is a reason why successive governments in this country have talked tough on crime. And I don't say that populism is always factually accurate. I don't say it's always the right approach. But what does it indicate? It indicates that if the left want their way, to have rehabilitation without punishment, even if that was really the right thing to do, and I'm not convinced it is, it would never be accepted by the wider public. It just wouldn't. We will never in this country see a situation where we have Nordic-style prisons. Why? Because the majority simply won't accept it. And governments know that. They don't want to lose votes. Politicians want to get voted in. You will get people like the Green Party that can afford to be ideological on this. They can afford to be pro-criminal because they're a protest party. I don't think much of the Greens at all. I don't think... And actually, what you'd probably see happen, if the Greens got a lot more seats, you'd probably see even the Green Party change their stance a little bit and be a little bit more accepting of the fact that punishment is part of the equation. But at the moment, they've got a couple of MPs and they're a very niche vote. They tend to be, young left-wing people who feel about the environment and feel about Palestine, and that's the sort of votes it attracts, and that's fine. There's a place for that. But I think that when you look at national government, Labour, Tory, they understand that showing sympathy to criminals is simply not a vote winner. That might seem crude, it might seem shallow, but that's political reality. So that's why Starmer and Cooper and so on, they always talk tough on crime. You might say, oh, they shouldn't be pandering to the right. This is one area of pandering to the right I actually agree with. Because, working class people and the sort of people that Labour should be standing up for are often on the front lines of this. They're often the people most affected by crime. So why wouldn't a working class person feel strongly about this, for example? So I think that the left just don't get that. They will say, oh, but only if we follow this model of rehabilitation first and only will we reduce crime. But they're not understanding. The public will never, ever, ever accept a situation where you have a heinous crime and then this notion that the perpetrator shouldn't face any punishment. Because I think there's some on the left who aren't even content with minor punishment. They want no punishment. That is an extreme position. It's an extreme position. It's a reckless position. It's a very callous position, actually. Because I think if you're saying you sympathise with victims, and yet you're simultaneously saying the perpetrators, the people who have put them through that emotional turmoil, shouldn't face any punishment, how can you with a straight face say that you sympathise with victims? It doesn't make sense. If you genuinely sympathise with victims, or perhaps put it this way, if you genuinely have empathy for victims, you will understand their need for justice. No prison sentence will bring back the loved one. They understand that, and so does the wider public, but it should at least reflect the seriousness of the crime. Getting back to what I said at the start of the video regarding some of the false narratives, This idea that we just lock people up and throw away the key, which the left like to put out there, it's not true. In many, many cases, you get repeat offenders appear before a judge time and time and time again, and they're not sent to prison. They're given community sentences. If you look at televised verdicts, judges will almost always mention rehabilitation. So this argument from the left that rehabilitation's been ignored and we just focus on punitive punishment is simply false. Now, I happen to think judges in this country are too soft. The left, some actually believe they're too hard. You might argue certain cases, but the thing is, they're not talking about issues around free speech and so on. They're talking about actual heinous crimes. Violent young thugs targeting a vulnerable old person. I mean, I think 2.5 years for that is an utterly disgraceful, pathetic sentence. Yet there's people out there, including, I suspect, some of those who responded, actually would like to see an even less sentence. How dismissive of that man's family. Try putting yourself in their shoes and considering that the person who killed your loved one will be free to roam around the streets because of their age. That's perverse. I find it deeply contemptible, to be quite honest. Contemptible. Because they might say, their response to that would be, oh, but we're not saying they could just roam around freely. But yes, actually, by definition, that's what you are saying. Because if they're not in prison, how do you expect them to just abide by their community sentence rules? This is the point that the left don't get. When you have repeat offenders, they are not put off crime by a tap on the wrist. They're just not. So common sense shows that it therefore warrants a much tougher penalty. I've argued before we should have some sort of scared straight, and I know that will be controversial. I don't care. I think we need something that will really shock young offenders into changing their ways. Now, it's very easy to say, oh, but look at the background, poverty, poor education, mental health problems, all the rest of it. Those things shouldn't be dismissed at all. But I have a big, big problem with this attitude of, well, they don't have a youth club to go to, so that explains, and that can excuse them beating someone to a pulp. There's a fundamental aspect of this that is, crime is wrong. And if you can't bring yourself to condemn the criminal, you don't really have an argument. You know, you could say the crime's awful, but if you cannot bring yourself to condemn the criminal, I don't care if they're 14 or 34. If you cannot condemn them for what they have done, you don't have an argument as far as I'm concerned. How can you? How can you even begin to approach this subject if you're not acknowledging that offenders have to be held accountable for their own actions? So the left-wing stance on this, I don't just disagree with it. Frankly, if they really had what they wanted, it scares me what the implications of that would be. I think the system has a hell of a lot of improving to do, but it could be worse. It could be what some of these people on the political left are advocating for. I mean, I don't think the public would ever accept it, but the very fact that if your first attitude to this is rehabilitation, let's not talk about punishment. You know, this teenager has left an old person dead. They have put fireworks into an old lady's house, causing her to die from smoke inhalation. They have terrorized another young person because, you know, they might argue I'm just vilifying young people. Young people are themselves often victims of crime. And you'll find that a 15 or 16-year-old who's been assaulted for no reason, they will want to see justice as much as anyone. But what the left just do not understand is that politically, most politicians don't want to appear to be sympathetic to criminals, and there is a reason for that. Now, on that point of when I say criminal sympathiser, it's curious that the left get offended by that, because it's not really an offensive term, it's just a literal term. If your first instinct is to sympathise with people committing crime, a criminal, then by definition you're a criminal sympathiser. It's not like I'm calling you some crude name, it's just adjective, it's just you are sympathising with criminals, you're a criminal sympathiser. And yeah, it's used as a pejorative in the sense that it's a critique, but it's an accurate one, it really is. I don't know how they can claim otherwise. You know, if you're bleating about how awful someone's background is, and then you say, well, that should, oh, they're only 14 or 15, we shouldn't punish them. You're sympathising with them. So just be honest about that. I'd have a bit more respect for left-wing arguments if they were honest that they sympathise with criminals. But they're not. They pretend to care about victims and then go on to advocate for the criminals. Now, some people have to do that. We believe in due process in this country, so a defence lawyer would have to do that. Right, that's their job. But people who are ideologically sympathetic to criminals, I think that they really lack understanding or consideration for the mental anguish that victims of crime feel. Most victims of crime. I should say most, because there will even be some victims of crime who, think more on the left-wing ideology of this. But I think it's fair to speculate that most victims of crime want to see the perpetrators punished. And why wouldn't they? And why shouldn't they? It's another challenge I have for the left. What right do you have? What right do you have to deny justice to victims of crime? To say, well, I sympathise with what you've been through, but I don't think the 16-year-old thug who put a firework through your door should face any punishment. That's sick. You don't teach young offenders to change their ways by saying, oh, well, look, it's everyone else's fault. You've had a hard upbringing. It's all someone else's fault. No, I just don't think you get them to change their ways that way. But I'll follow up with that, because of course you get examples where some young offenders come from hellish backgrounds. If someone has, say, a sex worker mother and a heroin addict father, or an armed robber for a father, obviously they're not going to be brought up well. I'm not stupid, I get that. And that's why I say that looking at the root causes should not be dismissed. I totally agree with that. But what I have a problem with left-wing thinking is look at the root causes, look at rehabilitation, but we shouldn't have any punishment at all. That is extreme, it's stupid, and it's callous. It really is. Try putting yourself in the shoes of someone who's surrounded by a gang who wants to lay into them, whether it's to get money or just because they're bored or whatever other reason it is. They're high on drugs, whatever it is. Now try telling that person who's been left in hospital or left afraid to leave their own home, well, it's awful what happened to you, but you should really understand the criminals. That's disgusting. It's shameful. So I'm unapologetically hardline on crime. I think any politician who advocates for leniency and rehabilitation without punishment is reckless. They're endangering the public. And of course, we can't have a situation where it is just punishment, but we don't. That's the point. We don't. It's a misleading narrative when the left say we just throw people away and that's it. It's not true. Now, you could argue that the rehabilitation should take different forms or it's not effective enough, but do not say that in this country criminals are just punished with nothing else happening. That is not true. It's empirically not true, because we see cases of career criminals committing offence after offence after offence and still avoiding jail. So how can you rationally say that we just throw them away? It's not true. There are examples of miscarriages of justice, but that's a different issue, because those people are actually innocent. They're not criminals. I think that's a terrible thing. And I think if someone spends years in prison for a crime they didn't commit, the state should not only apologise and pay out a hefty compensation, but they shouldn't charge a single penny for, this absurd thing about taking off money for board and bed. That's outrageous. A miscarriage of justice is a terrible thing. But where someone has been proven to have committed a heinous crime, they should be punished. It's a no-brainer. I just don't understand how the left can't make that connection. I mean, if your attitude to rape or arson or violent gang assault or unprovoked violence is they just need rehabilitation, they need to go through a course over their anger, or this is sick. It's really sick. because what you're saying is that person shouldn't have any accountability for what they've done. And I honestly have no respect for that argument. I've got no respect, I've got no patience with that argument. Not just because I personally think it's insulting to victims, I actually think it's dangerous to the wider public. And the irony about this is I don't think that my position is unreasonable. I'm not someone saying, we need to bring back hanging, let's just throw away the key. I do think rehabilitation has a place in cases where, for example, someone has served their time and they have to be brought out into the real world. Obviously, they're going to need some help in terms of settling back into society. In that case, I favour, giving them some sort of job so that they can keep straight. That makes sense, obviously. Otherwise, I'd just get back to the life of crime. I'm not stupid. I get that. And I even accept that rehabilitation can start to happen from the inside. What I do not accept, what I will never accept, is the outrageous attitude from the left of being against punishment in general. This idea of hostility to punishment, it's deluded. It really, really is. And frankly, even if it did work, even if it did reduce crime, and that's highly dubious, it would be insulting to the victims. Why shouldn't a victim of crime expect to see their perpetrator put behind bars? Why not? What gives you, I'm talking to the left here, a right to deny victims justice? Because you believe that, rehabilitation will reduce crime. It might, but I don't think it will reduce crime if the offender isn't learning that there's consequences for what they've done. Do you seriously think a hardened young offender is going to suddenly see the light and change their ways just because they're put on some course like learning to, whatever it would involve? What we need to do is look at the root causes, absolutely. Yes, address poverty. Yes, address abusive parents. Yes, address cycle of violence, generational. There's a lot of factors involved in that. I have no problem with talking about any of those things. I don't even have a problem with rehabilitation. I think rehabilitation makes sense. But what I have a big, big, big problem with is the left's animosity to the very idea of judicial punishment. If you're against punishment, you do not tell me that you believe in justice. You can't. It's an oxymoron. I'm sorry that your husband's been murdered. I'm sorry that your son's been violently assaulted. I'm sorry that your sister's been raped. But punishment's not the answer. Get real. Get real. And try imagining living in a neighbourhood where you're frightened to leave your own home. And then try thinking that what you're doing is defending bullies. Criminals are bullies. And by defending them, you're taking the side of the oppressor. It's not particularly progressive. So, I appreciate not everyone's going to agree with this. If you do lean to the left, you're going to say I'm just a reactionary or whatever. Say what you want. I don't block comments. Leave your comments. But I really, really do have a problem with the left's reckless animosity to the idea of judicial punishment. Because judicial punishment isn't punitive. It does serve a purpose. It protects the public. It holds the criminal to account. How can someone reform if they aren't facing any consequences for what they've done? How can they improve their life if they think that, okay, well, I've committed this crime and I'll get away with it. I just have to report to my parole officer, do a bit of community service, whatever. And we know this isn't hot air, because you see offenders themselves literally saying this. I cited the case of the 16-year-old in Merseyside who brought machete to a public area, and the judge mentioned how arrogant he was. He felt that his age would protect him. In the event, the judge gave him a suspended sentence anyway. This is the irony. Our judges are not too hard in this country. They're too damn soft. So the left have it skewered. We're not living in Texas. We're not living in a really hardline state. I'm not saying British prisons are a picnic. I think that's wrong. I think some of them, there is problems inside. I've always spoken out against prison vigilantism. I don't want to see a situation where inmates are running the place. And I think, when inmates take their own lives does need to be investigated. I think criminals should be punished, but I don't believe in brutality, right? So I think I have a pretty reasonable approach to this. Hell, it's probably middle ground, but because of the left's deranged opposition to the very idea of punishment, it forces people like me to be more on the right or more hardline on this, because it has to be countered. So this is a battle of ideology. You either believe in justice or you don't. If you're against punishment, you don't believe in justice. If you're advocating for criminals, you can't honestly say that you sympathise with victims. Maybe you think you do, but simply saying, "Oh, that's an awful crime," is not good enough if you're simultaneously saying, "Oh, but we shouldn't punish the person who done it." Madness. Absolute madness.